They parked their shiny SUV half on the sidewalk, half on the grass, whispering into phones and pointing at my front gate like I had rented my home out to an illegal car show. They looked at me like I had broken a sacred covenant of neighborliness. I looked at them and the world decided to move in slow motion for a moment, because they were about to do something painfully ordinary and wildly ironic. It started with a notice tacked to my mailbox. Complaint about unauthorized parking, they wrote, signed by the Homeowners Association. They always like to make their presence known with official forms and capital letters. I smiled when I read it, folded it under a magnet, and placed it on my refrigerator. My truck was in my driveway. My tag was current. The county sheriff's office decal was where it always was on the bumper. Besides, my driveway is not a HOA common area, and if anyone thought otherwise. I went to work as I always did, uniform ironed, badge clipped to my vest. People waved. I waved back. The house looked normal when I drove away. At lunch, a text arrived. They called the cops on you for parking in your driveway. The message had an emoji that wanted to be sympathetic and failed. I laughed out loud. They called the cops on me for parking in my driveway. The HOA had called the police because someone had neglected to park their car according to the unwritten rules of curb aesthetics, while failing to notice that the vehicle in question belonged to the person who keeps the peace in that very county. By mid-afternoon, multiple vehicles in the neighborhood were idling and shifting like a bunch of bees unsure of the queen. Word travels fast in cul-de-sacs. The HOA president, who cared for the neighborhood like a curator cares for a museum, marched across the street with the kind of righteous certainty that comes from long practice. He used phrases like, respect the community, and we all have to follow rules. I reminded them gently that the driveway is private property and that my vehicle was registered to my address. They folded this into a response that sounded like someone reading rules aloud rather than speaking with a neighbor. The man who lived directly across, the one who ran the HOA website and had strong opinions about gutter guards, declared he had called the county sheriff because neighbors deserve to feel safe. Voices rose. The toddler kept filming. Someone suggested towing. Someone else suggested a mediation session with donuts provided. An elderly woman pressed her palms together and asked if anything could be done to keep the peace. It felt like a PDA meeting that had accidentally acquired a soundtrack of passive urgency. Then the patrol car arrived. It rolled down the street, lights off because this was a domestic neighborhood dispute, not a high-speed drama. Two deputies stepped out, courteous and professional, glancing at body cameras that would later show faces and fidgeting hands. They asked what happened. The HOA president explained, with the same composed outrage he applied to community garden allocations. It was very thorough. He described a vehicle parked inappropriately and used the phrase, "We called because we care," like a blessing. The deputies stepped into the dance as neutral parties. They asked for registration, and I handed it to them. They checked the plate and then looked up to find the sheriff's badge and the familiar name on my uniform. There was a pause like the small, quiet moments between two beats of a drum. The deputy looked at me and blinked, an honest, human blink that said, "Oh." I could have leaned into it then. I could have said, loud enough for the HOA president's ears to burn, that I was the county sheriff and that perhaps the HOA might have misinterpreted their civic duty. But that would have been dramatic, and drama is not how law enforcement operates when law enforcement is also your neighbor. I lowered my voice and told the deputy it was fine, that it was a misunderstanding, and to please help explain to everyone that I was simply parked at home. The chaplain of small community grievances nodded and set about doing exactly that. Still, news traveled. More people turned up. A woman with a clipboard began to take notes that would later be used in a newsletter. The HOA president insisted that policies had to be enforced uniformly. Enforced uniformly meant enforced the way he read them at 8 a.m. after coffee. Enforced uniformly meant something else in this neighborhood. It meant enforced like a script where the actors never change roles. When someone in this crowd found out who I was, there was a visible recalibration. Faces that had been hot with righteous complaint cooled like milk put back in the fridge. "You didn't tell us you were the sheriff," someone said, not as a question but as an accusation. There is a particular flavor to being accused of omission, like someone assumes you owed them the labor of announcing your job title at sunrise. I told them I had paid the HOA dues when appropriate, that I volunteered for the local food drive, that I was not hiding my name. The real heat peaked when someone suggested there had been a prior incident, a near run-in with a delivery truck that wasn't parked tastefully. They brought up receipts, dates, and a level of indignation that required documentation. One neighbor had even taken pictures with timestamps. They were proud of the timekeeping. I listened, and then I went home and opened my front office drawer and pulled out a printed copy of the property deed and a county code snippet that made my right to park plainly obvious on paper. They read it, and some of them glanced down to see that my name and address matched. The HOA president called a brief adjournment of his own personal crusade against driveway anarchy. He offered a sincere apology if there was any misunderstanding, which landed like a tea bag in hot water. It had substance, but left the taste of something a little bitter. He also said they would consider revising their complaint procedures to include a neighbor verification step. I suggested, mildly, that perhaps a quick knock or a polite question might spare the paperwork. It should have ended there, but stories have a way of growing when people retell them. The HOA president recast the day like a cautionary tale about community standards and communication. By morning, the tale had acquired color and unrelated details. A reporter called looking for a human angle. I issued a calm statement and refused to turn the moment into a headline. I was not interested in making anyone look foolish using the power of my office. There is an odd double standard when your job is to enforce the law and your neighbors feel obligated to enforce social rules. You become both a symbol of authority and an equal in a community of equals. They want you to be tough on other people but tolerant when it comes to their own oversights. That double standard sits on porches and at potlucks like a cousin you can't send an RSVP to politely. You navigate it with the patience of someone who knows that power without empathy is just noise. In the weeks that followed, the HOA reprinted their parking guidelines, added a FAQ to their website, and organized an open house where neighbors could learn how to fill out complaint forms. I went because it felt important to be part of the conversation. I sat at a folding table and listened to their worries, and they listened to mine. A woman explained that she had once been threatened by a stranger who parked outside at night. A man said that he valued curb appeal because it increased property values. One neighbor offered to install a community group chat so people could ask about potential infractions before escalating to skipping someone's mailbox with a notice. Another neighbor proposed a friendly sign that said, "Please be considerate," rather than "Do not park here." Little changes like these matter because they create opportunities to humanize the disagreeable parts of living close to others. In the end, we learned something simple. Rules without conversation can feel like rules imposed by strangers. Conversation without respect can feel like nagging. The trick is to have both, a system that protects property and a culture that remembers people. I still walk the dog past the houses that once wanted to lecture me. Sometimes we exchange a small smile now. Once, the HOA president came over with a plate of muffins, and we both laughed about the absurdity and the embarrassment he had felt. I told him I understood how easy it is to see what you want to see when you are primed to do so. When the next newsletter went out, it included a short piece about neighborly communication penned by someone who had once called law enforcement on a neighbor for parking in his own driveway. The tone was softer. The article suggested a simple rule: knock first, then call if you must. It was small, but it meant something. It meant that the community could learn and that authority could be gentle. Sometimes being sheriff is not about asserting power, but about modeling calm. Sitting at the kitchen table with my badge on the counter and a mug of coffee in my hands, I realized that enforcement is easier when people trust the officer behind the badge. That trust is not automatic, and it cannot be demanded. It must be earned, coffee by coffee, call by call, conversation by conversation. And sometimes it starts with a knock on the door and a neighborly hello rather than a tacked-on notice that reads like a summons. I still get a story or two at the next HOA meeting. People like to remember the day the sheriff's truck caused a minor scandal. They tell it with gentle exaggerations and fond chuckles. They tell it as a warning and as a testament to the idea that even in a small place, small things reveal larger truths. And maybe that's right. Maybe the parking spat was less about asphalt stripes and more about whether a community could choose empathy over escalation. The driveway still belongs to me, but the neighborhood is ours.